Welcome back to the channel. A 19-year-old college freshman leaves a party after midnight, too intoxicated to walk on her own. A classmate offers to walk her back to the dorms. She is never seen again. For the next 25 years, there will be no body, no crime scene, no physical evidence at all for years connecting anyone to what happened to her that night. Her own campus police department will wait 4 full days before even beginning to investigate seriously. There will be a name, though, almost from the start. From the very first days, investigators will suspect one specific young man, the one who volunteered to walk her home. Cadaver dogs will alert to his dorm room within days of her disappearance. He will show up in his booking photo just 2 days later with a black eye he cannot consistently explain. And still, for 25 years, nobody will be able to charge him with anything. He will go on to live an ordinary life, accused over the years by more women than anyone can easily count, of exactly the kind of behavior that first made him a suspect. And still, no charges. No trial. No answers for a family that has now waited longer than their daughter was ever alive. It will take a true crime podcast, made by a man who was 8 years old when she vanished, to finally reopen the case. It will take a deck in a quiet California backyard to finally provide something close to proof. And even after a conviction, even after every appeal has run its course, one question will remain completely unanswered. Nobody will ever find her body. This is the story of Kristin Smart and the 25 years it took to convict a man for a murder with no body, no weapon, and no crime scene ever found. If you're new here, go ahead and subscribe. We cover real cold cases every week. Cases where the truth waited years, sometimes decades, to surface, and where court transcripts, sworn testimony, and official case files eventually tell us exactly what happened, no matter how long it takes to get there. And if you're already subscribed, tap that like button. It helps this story reach more people who only remember the outline of this case and never heard exactly how it finally ended. Now, back to San Luis Obispo, California, May of 1996. Kristin Denise Smart was a 19-year-old freshman at California Polytechnic State University, known to nearly everyone as Cal Poly, located in San Luis Obispo along California's central coast. She had grown up wanting to study marine biology, drawn to the ocean and animal life from a young age. Friends and family described her as warm, adventurous, and generally well-liked around campus, adjusting, like most freshmen, to her first year away from home in a new city, in a new dormitory, surrounded largely by people she had only known for a matter of months. San Luis Obispo, tucked along California's central coast between Los Angeles and San Francisco, had the feel of a classic American college town. Low-rise buildings, a walkable downtown, and a university that dominated much of the local economy and culture. For an incoming freshman like Kristin, it was the kind of place that felt safe, even as she navigated the ordinary uncertainties of her first year living away from home. By the spring of 1996, Kristin had nearly finished her first year at Cal Poly. Memorial Day weekend that year fell at the very end of May, a natural moment for students to blow off steam before finals and the end of the school year. The kind of weekend that, for most of the students there, would simply blend into the general memory of a busy freshman year. On the night of May 24th, 1996, Kristin went to an off-campus party with friends. She would never make it back to her dorm room. The party that night was held at a house on Crandall Way, near campus, and drew a crowd that included members of the Kappa Chi fraternity, along with numerous other students, some of whom Kristin may not have known well, if at all. It was, by every account, an ordinary end-of-year college party, the kind happening on and around nearly every American campus that same weekend. At some point during the party, Kristin became extremely intoxicated. It was never entirely clear afterward whether that intoxication came purely from alcohol, or whether something else may have contributed to how quickly and severely it hit her. Witnesses later described her as unable to stand on her own, eventually ending up passed out on the lawn next to the house, in full view of other partygoers who had no way of knowing they were watching the beginning of the final hours of her life. A fellow student named Cheryl Anderson, who was also at the party, began helping Kristin walk back toward campus. They were soon joined by another partygoer, a fellow freshman named Paul Flores, someone Kristin knew only casually, if at all, from around the dormitories. According to accounts pieced together afterward, Flores and another student, Cheryl Manzer, helped walk Kristin back toward the dormitories. As the group approached the intersection of Perimeter Road and Grand Avenue, close to their dorms, at around 2 o'clock in the morning, Manzer broke away from the other two, leaving Kristin and Paul Flores together for the final stretch back to their residence halls, a walk of only a few remaining minutes. That was the last confirmed sighting of Kristin Smart. She and Paul Flores, alone, only steps from their dorms, in the early hours of May 25, 1996. Flores would later claim that after walking Kristin back, he went straight to his own room in Santa Lucia Hall, alone, and had no further contact with her that night or ever again. It was a simple, tidy account, one that would take investigators the better part of 3 decades to seriously challenge in a courtroom. What happened next remains one of the most criticized parts of the entire case. For days, almost nobody in a position of authority treated Kristin's disappearance as urgent, even as the people who actually knew her grew increasingly alarmed. Friends who noticed Kristin hadn't returned, including a classmate named Margarita Campos, raised concerns almost immediately, telling anyone who would listen that something felt seriously wrong. Campus police, according to later accounts, largely dismissed those early worries, apparently assuming Kristin was simply off enjoying herself somewhere on a long holiday weekend and would turn up on her own once classes resumed. 2 days after the party, Kristin's mother, Denise Smart, received a call from Cal Poly's campus police, informing her that her daughter hadn't been seen since the weekend and asking whether Kristin might be with her. It was the first Denise had heard that anything was wrong at all. A mother 300 miles away, learning secondhand from a police department that her daughter had already been unaccounted for 2 full days, with no explanation yet for why nobody had called her sooner. By the time campus police actually began a formal investigation, Kristin had already been missing for 4 full days. 4 days during which any physical evidence at the actual scene, wherever that scene was, had time to degrade, be cleaned up, or simply disappear entirely. Records from that early investigation later revealed an unsettling detail about how campus police initially characterized Kristin herself. An incident report filed just days after she vanished noted that she does not have any close friends at Cal Poly, and that she appeared to be under the influence of alcohol the night she disappeared. Language her family would later point to, for years afterward, as evidence that investigators spent as much energy scrutinizing the victim's character and choices as they did pursuing an actual suspect in her disappearance. With campus police slow to treat the case with urgency, much of the earliest, most critical search effort fell to Kristin's own family and a small group of dedicated volunteers. Denise Smart and her husband Stan traveled to San Luis Obispo within days, working with local volunteers to distribute flyers across the city, organize searches of nearby open space and hiking trails, and press investigators for updates that, in those first crucial weeks, rarely came in any meaningful form. The family would later describe those early months as a uniquely painful kind of limbo, grieving a daughter who had not been declared dead, while simultaneously fighting what felt like an uphill battle just to get law enforcement to treat her case with the seriousness it deserved. Denise Smart became, over the following decades, one of the most visible and persistent advocates in the case, giving interviews, working with reporters, and refusing to let her daughter's story fade from public memory, even as year after year passed without an arrest. Despite being the last person confirmed to have seen Kristin alive, Paul Flores was not formally interviewed by investigators until 6 days after she disappeared. 2 days after Kristin vanished, Flores was booked on an unrelated, outstanding DUI warrant. His booking photo from that arrest showed a visible black eye. When asked about it, Flores reportedly offered 3 different explanations over time for how he'd gotten it, inconsistencies that stood out immediately to investigators looking at him as a potential suspect. Cadaver dogs were eventually brought in to search the Cal Poly dormitories. When they reached Santa Lucia Hall, several separate dogs, working independently of one another and without any knowledge of which room investigators suspected, alerted specifically to Paul Flores's dorm room, near his bed, reacting in the way trained cadaver dogs react to the presence of human decomposition. It was, by any measure, a significant piece of circumstantial evidence, gathered within days of Kristin's disappearance, at a moment when a proper, thorough forensic search of that same dorm room, conducted with the urgency the case deserved from the very beginning, might have settled the entire question on the spot, decades before any trial ever took place. And yet, without a body, without a confession, and without any other direct physical evidence connecting Flores to a crime, prosecutors determined they simply did not have enough to bring charges. The dorm room itself was, notably, never seized and preserved as a crime scene the way it likely would be in a case investigated with the urgency it deserved from the very first day. Paul Flores would remain, informally, the case's only real suspect, but an uncharged one, free to finish his degree, graduate, and move on with his life for the next 25 years. Kristin Smart was legally declared dead in 2002, 6 years after she disappeared, without her body ever having been recovered, a legal formality that let her family begin, in some limited sense, to move forward, even without any real answers about what had actually happened to her. Her case remained technically open, revisited periodically by investigators, but effectively stalled for lack of anything resembling a breakthrough. Search efforts over the years turned up nothing. Tips came in and led nowhere. Paul Flores, never charged with anything connected to Kristin, went on with his life largely unimpeded, eventually relocating to Southern California. According to accusations that would only become public years later, that life included repeated allegations from other women over more than 2 decades, describing behavior strikingly similar to whatever might have happened to Kristin that night in 1996. Prosecutors would later describe, in court filings, dozens of women who came forward over the years to describe a pattern of predatory behavior, spanning what one filing called 25 years as a serial rapist. Some women who knew him during those years reportedly referred to him, informally, by nicknames like Chester the Molester and Psycho Paul, grim, half-joking labels that in hindsight carried far more weight than anyone treated them with at the time. None of these accusations, spread out across different cities and different years, were ever connected to one another in any formal, systematic way until investigators went back and reconstructed the pattern decades later, a pattern that, prosecutors would later argue, had been hiding in plain sight the entire time, scattered across separate police reports that nobody had ever thought to cross-reference against a 25-year-old missing persons case. For Kristin's family, These were 2 decades spent without a body to bury, without a trial to attend, and without any real resolution. Just an open case file, and a name investigators had suspected almost from day one, but had never been able to charge. Every few years, a new detective would be assigned to review the file. A new round of media coverage would briefly reignite public interest, and then, without new evidence to act on, the case would quietly recede from view once again. By the late 2000s and into the 2010s, Kristin Smart's case had, for much of the country outside San Luis Obispo, faded into the general background noise of unsolved American crime. A name some people vaguely recognized, attached to a story most had never heard the specifics of. Local news occasionally ran anniversary pieces. True crime message boards kept a small, dedicated community of amateur investigators engaged. But without any real forward momentum from law enforcement, the case risked becoming exactly the kind of file that quietly gathers dust for good, its answers permanently out of reach. That is precisely the environment Chris Lambert's podcast entered in 2019, and precisely why its impact turned out to be so significant. It did not simply retell a story people already knew. For a large portion of its audience, it introduced Kristin Smart's case for the very first time, complete with details that had never before reached a wide, national audience. In 2019, a musician and recording engineer named Chris Lambert, who had been just 8 years old when Kristin disappeared, released a podcast called Your Own Backyard, dedicated entirely to investigating her case. Lambert had no formal background in journalism or criminal investigation, simply a fascination with the case that had lingered, unresolved, for his entire adult life, and a determination to try tracking down answers that professional investigators had never quite managed to find. Lambert spent months tracking down witnesses who, remarkably, had never been formally interviewed by investigators over the preceding 2 decades, and pieced together a detailed account of the party, the walk home, and the earliest days of the botched investigation. He combed through old records, tracked down former Cal Poly students scattered across the country, and slowly reconstructed a timeline more detailed than anything the public had previously had access to. The podcast became enormously popular, reigniting national interest in a case that had largely faded from public attention outside of San Luis Obispo County, drawing millions of listeners and turning armchair investigators around the country into an unofficial extension of the original search effort. San Luis Obispo County Sheriff Ian Parkinson later credited the renewed public pressure and information generated by the podcast as a real, tangible factor in the investigation's eventual progress. It's been a puzzle, and it's a very slow process to find each of those little pieces, Parkinson told reporters years later. Some of that information came to light through the podcast many of you are familiar with. Cold case investigators had also uncovered additional evidence pointing toward Flores as far back as 2016, 3 years before the podcast's release. Work that, combined with the renewed public attention and fresh witness accounts generated 3 years later, helped set the stage for what came next. In March of 2021, investigators executed a search warrant at the Arroyo Grande home of Paul Flores' father, Ruben Flores, a modest property south of Cal Poly, where Ruben had lived for years, largely out of the public eye, despite his son's long-standing status as the case's presumed suspect. Using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs, investigators identified a significant anomaly beneath the home's back deck, an area roughly 6 feet by 4 feet, shielded from casual view by lattice paneling that appeared, to at least one archaeologist brought in to examine it, similar in shape and size to what a gravesite might look like. Investigators used hammers and drills to disassemble sections of the deck itself in order to properly access and examine the ground underneath. Soil samples taken from beneath the deck and from inside a trailer on the property after it was treated with a forensic chemical later tested positive for the presence of human blood. No bones, no teeth, and no other skeletal remains were ever recovered from the site, a detail the defense would seize on repeatedly in the years that followed, arguing that a blood trace alone proved nothing about an actual burial. Prosecutors would later argue that Kristin's body had, in fact, once been buried beneath that deck, hidden for years in the backyard of a quiet residential home just a short drive from campus, and had since been moved to a different, still unknown location, sometime in the years between her disappearance and the eventual search. Likely once suspicion around the Flores family began to grow too strong to risk leaving her there. Over the years between the podcast's release and the eventual searches of the Flores properties, Paul Flores's status shifted publicly, gradually, from person of interest to suspect to, eventually, the prime suspect. Labels that carried real weight in public opinion, even without a single formal charge ever being filed against him. That gradual shift mattered. It meant that by the time investigators finally moved to search Ruben Flores's property in early 2021, they were doing so with the benefit of decades of accumulated suspicion, renewed witness statements, and a level of public and political pressure that had simply never existed in quite the same way during the case's earlier, quieter years. On April 13, 2021, nearly 25 years after Kristin Smart disappeared, Paul Flores, then 44 years old, was arrested at his home in San Pedro, California, a coastal community in the Los Angeles area, and formally charged with her murder. His father, Ruben Flores, then 80 years old, was arrested and charged separately as an accessory after the fact, accused of helping his son conceal Kristin's body for decades, a charge that, if proven, meant a father had knowingly helped hide his own son's victim for the better part of a quarter century. Kristin's family, who had waited nearly a quarter of a century for this exact moment, released a statement calling it a bittersweet day they had long anticipated and a first step toward bringing their daughter home. They added, in the same statement, that while Kristin's loving spirit will always live in our hearts, their life without her hugs, laughs, and smiles is a heartache that never abates. Words that reflected both the relief of finally seeing an arrest and the recognition that an arrest alone would never undo 25 years of unanswered questions. Both men were arraigned days later and pleaded not guilty to all charges. A judge later lowered Ruben Flores's bail from $250,000 to $50,000, allowing him to be released while awaiting trial. Paul Flores remained in custody without bail. During a lengthy 22-day preliminary hearing, prosecutors sought to introduce evidence that Flores had drugged and raped 4 separate women in the years after Kristin's disappearance, and had engaged in dozens of other troubling incidents involving unwanted touching, stalking, and aggressive sexual behavior. The presiding judge ultimately ruled that this evidence could not be introduced at the preliminary hearing stage, though the door remained open for prosecutors to revisit it later, at trial itself. Defense attorneys, for their part, argued throughout the preliminary hearing that prosecutors had failed to present enough evidence to support the charges at all, an argument the judge rejected, finding sufficient probable cause, a lower legal bar than the standard prosecutors would eventually need to meet at trial for the case to move forward. Because of the case's overwhelming local notoriety, decades of media coverage, and the massive popularity of Lambert's podcast, the trial was moved out of San Luis Obispo County entirely, relocated more than 100 miles north to Monterey County, where jurors would, in theory, be less likely to have already formed an opinion about Paul Flores's guilt before ever setting foot in the courtroom. Opening statements began in July of 2022. Over the following 3 months, prosecutors laid out their case piece by piece. The cadaver dog alerts from 1996, the inconsistent explanations for the black eye, the human blood found beneath Ruben Flores's deck, and, this time, testimony from some of the women who accused Paul Flores of sexual violence in the years since Kristin's disappearance, which the trial judge allowed prosecutors to present as evidence of a broader, established pattern of behavior, testimony that had been specifically excluded at the earlier preliminary hearing, but was now permitted before the jury that would actually decide his fate. Prosecutors argued that Flores had raped or attempted to rape Kristin Smart inside his dorm room in Santa Lucia Hall, killing her in the process. Then enlisted his father's help years later to relocate and permanently conceal her remains, a theory that tied together the cadaver dog evidence from 1996 with the blood evidence recovered from Ruben Flores's property some 25 years afterward. Defense attorneys for both men argued that the prosecution's entire case was built on inference, decades-old memories, and evidence that, however suggestive, never actually included a body, a weapon, or definitive proof that a crime had occurred inside that dorm room at all. They pointed repeatedly to the absence of any recovered remains as the central, unresolved weakness in the government's entire theory of the case. For jurors sitting through 3 months of testimony, the case presented an unusual challenge, weighing evidence that spanned more than a quarter of a century, from decades-faded memories of a college party to soil samples collected just months before the trial began. There was no single, decisive piece of evidence, no murder weapon, no confession, no video footage, that on its own proved Paul Flores's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Instead, prosecutors built their case the way investigators had ultimately built the entire 26-year effort, piece by piece, witness by witness, allowing an accumulation of circumstantial detail to tell a story that no single fact could tell on its own. It was, in its own way, a testament to how far forensic techniques, investigative persistence, and public engagement with the case had come since 1996, when a botched 4-day delay in even beginning to investigate had nearly buried the truth for good. On October 18, 2022, after 3 months of testimony, a Monterey County jury reached its verdict. Paul Flores was found guilty of first-degree murder, unanimously, more than 26 years after he was last seen walking Kristin Smart back to her dormitory. His father, Ruben Flores, was found not guilty of being an accessory after the fact, a split verdict that meant, even after a guilty finding against the man who killed her, questions about exactly who helped conceal Kristin's body and how, and for how long, remained legally unresolved. The blood evidence found beneath his deck was, in the end, apparently not enough on its own to convince the jury that Ruben Flores had knowingly participated in hiding his son's crime. San Luis Obispo County District Attorney Dan Dow called it a moment when our criminal and victim justice system has finally delivered justice for Kristin Smart, for the Smart family, and for our San Luis Obispo County community. A statement that, after 26 years, carried the weight of an entire generation's wait for an answer. Outside the courthouse, members of Kristin's family embraced, some in tears, marking the end of a legal process that had outlasted an entire childhood, adolescence, and adulthood for anyone who had been a small child the year Kristin disappeared. The acquittal of Ruben Flores left an uncomfortable gap at the center of the case's resolution. If Kristin's body really had been buried beneath his deck, as prosecutors argued, and as the blood evidence strongly suggested, then someone had to have put her there, and someone had to have later moved her elsewhere. The jury's decision to convict the son while acquitting the father meant that, legally, no one has ever been held accountable for whatever happened to her remains after 1996, only for what happened to her that first night. For investigators, the acquittal did not end the search for Kristin's body. If anything, it left the exact chain of what happened to her remains after her death as unfinished business, a mystery inside the larger mystery that the trial had only partially resolved. On March 10, 2023, nearly 27 years after Kristin Smart disappeared, Paul Flores was formally sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Before handing down the sentence, Monterey County Superior Court Judge Jennifer O'Keefe rejected a series of defense motions seeking to overturn the conviction, acquit Flores outright, or order an entirely new trial. Addressing Flores directly, the judge did not mince words, describing him as a cancer to society, a description that, for a case built almost entirely on decades of accumulated circumstantial evidence, captured just how thoroughly the court had come to view him. Flores was also ordered to register as a sex offender for the rest of his life. Now 46 years old, he had spent more than half of that life as the presumed but uncharged suspect in one of California's most closely watched unsolved cases. Free to attend college, build a career, form relationships, and move through the world largely unburdened by formal accusation, and would now spend a significant portion of what remained of it behind bars, finally facing consequences that had eluded him for nearly 3 decades. He would also be required to serve his sentence in state prison rather than the county jail where he had awaited trial, a formal recognition of the severity of the crime he had finally been held accountable for. Even after conviction and sentencing, Paul Flores's legal fight was far from over. His attorneys appealed the conviction to California's 2nd District Court of Appeal. In October of 2025, that court issued a written opinion affirming the original conviction, rejecting the arguments raised on appeal. Flores then petitioned the California Supreme Court to review the case one final time. On January 14, 2026, nearly 30 years after Kristin disappeared, and roughly 3 years after his original sentencing, the California Supreme Court formally denied that petition, closing off what had been one of Flores's last realistic paths to overturning the conviction through the normal appeals process. Flores's legal team did not give up easily. Throughout the appeals process, his attorneys argued that the trial court had made a series of errors, allowing testimony about the other women's allegations, which they claimed unfairly prejudiced the jury against him, questioning whether the evidence recovered from beneath Ruben Flores's deck should ever have been admitted at all, and challenging the overall sufficiency of a case built so heavily on decades-old circumstantial evidence rather than direct proof. Each of these arguments worked its way through the California court system over the following several years, a process that, for a case already defined by its extraordinary length, added yet another chapter to an already decades-long legal saga. The October 2025 appellate ruling and the January 2026 California Supreme Court denial represented, for Kristin's family, the final formal confirmation that the conviction their community had waited 26 years to see would, in fact, stand. Even with a conviction, and now a fully exhausted set of state appeals, more than 3 decades after Kristin Smart disappeared, one central piece of the case has never been resolved. Nobody has ever found her body. Investigators have never stopped looking. As recently as the spring of 2026, law enforcement served a new search warrant at a property connected to Paul Flores's mother, once again bringing in forensic specialists, soil testing, and search teams to look for any physical trace of where Kristin's remains might have ultimately ended up, 30 years after she disappeared. That search reportedly turned up soil results described by investigators as consistent with what they were looking for, though as of this recording, no confirmed remains have been recovered from that site either. Sheriff's investigators have made clear, publicly, that the search for Kristin's body is not treated as closed simply because her killer has been convicted. For a family that has spent 30 years without a grave to visit, that distinction matters enormously. The conviction settled the question of guilt, but it did not, and still has not, brought their daughter home in any physical sense. For Kristin's family, the conviction answered the question of who was responsible. It has never answered the question they have now been asking for 3 decades. Where is she? Paul Flores remains incarcerated today, serving his 25 years to life sentence, with his appeals through the California court system now fully exhausted. He was reportedly attacked by a fellow inmate at some point during his incarceration, requiring hospitalization. A reminder that, even behind bars, his case, and the strong feelings it continues to provoke, has never entirely faded from public consciousness. His father, Ruben Flores, was acquitted of the accessory charge and was never convicted of any crime connected to Kristin's disappearance, despite the human blood found beneath the deck of his own home. Kristin Smart's case became, in the years after Chris Lambert's podcast reignited public attention, a defining example of how a case that seemed permanently stalled could still, decades later, find its way to a courtroom, not because of a single dramatic breakthrough, but because of the slow accumulation of evidence, renewed public pressure, and investigators who refused to let a 30-year-old file simply stay closed. It also became, for critics of how the original 1996 investigation was handled, a lasting example of how badly the earliest days of a case can go wrong, and how much of that early damage can never fully be undone, no matter what happens years later. It took 25 years to arrest the man responsible. It took 26 years to convict him. And even now, with that conviction upheld through every level of appeal available to him, the most basic, painful question in the entire case remains exactly where it has always been. Nobody knows where Kristin Smart's body is. Her family got a name. They got a verdict. They got a judge calling her killer a cancer to society, and a sentence that will likely keep him in prison for the rest of his natural life. They got, after 3 decades, a small measure of the accountability they had spent most of their adult lives fighting for. What they still do not have, after 30 years, is their daughter.